Australia is a great place to live. A lot of people want to come here. I'm one of them. There's a serious question about whether we should have open borders and let in anyone who wants to come, or whether we should have closed borders and let just a few people in. If we do let in only a small number of migrants, will they be the people who are most in need, who are probably from a different culture, or will they just be people like me, from a similar culture? I spoke to Christian Barry about the arguments for open borders.
Sometimes this idea is motivated very much by some appeal to sort of the unfairness of the fact that being born on one side of the border or on the other side can make this dramatic difference to your life prospects. You know, if you happen to be born to the south or the north of the Rio Grande, which divides North America from Mexico, this can make this enormous difference to your prospects across a whole different range of dimensions. And this seems unfair. And so one view is that, well, if we embrace some notion of sort of fair equality of opportunity, we should try to do away with these sort of morally arbitrary divisions of people, just as we hopefully are in the process of doing away with the fact that people have different life prospects simply being based on their color of their skin or on their gender. So too, these geographical accidents should simply be wiped out.
The case for open borders isn't just about global inequality. I spoke with John Thrasher, who explained why libertarians believe that governments just don't have the moral authority to restrict freedom of movement. This view doesn't rely on any concern about fairness or about meeting people's needs.
The view that most classical liberals and libertarians have on this issue is that, you know, the borders between, say, Australia and some other country are very similar to the borders between, say, Victoria and New South Wales. They're important, they regulate certain kinds of jurisdictional boundaries, but there's nothing kind of magical about them that when people cross one, they should be stopped, but not on the other. And so people tend to think that there's a kind of notion of freedom of movement that's involved. But there's a larger point, too, which is that libertarians and classical liberals tend to think of people as a kind of resource. That is, that there's a net benefit to having more and better people in a society. So if you kind of understand the value, the most important resource of a society, it's its people. And so kind of getting more of them, people want to come to your society and then taking advantage of that, that's always usually a benefit. Whereas I think there's a tendency to think of immigrants as a kind of net cost in a lot of sense. And that's just not usually how the classical liberals think. They think of the kind of the minds coming in, an additional level of creativity, ability to solve problems and add something to the society that wasn't there in the first place. And so I think that part of it is that there's a kind of moral question about whether or not there should be this boundary. And then there's another kind of practical thing, which is that there tends to be a benefit from it as well. And that's played out by a lot of economic evidence to that effect.
If borders are morally arbitrary, and freedom of movement would be better, then why not just have open borders? Are there any moral reasons for restricting our freedom of movement? Christian Barry again.
Essential to the idea of a community is this idea of determination of membership, that there are some sort of rights of freedom of association and determination of membership that seem critical to a community being self-determining, and that we sort of undermine that unduly if we simply make it impossible that communities can regulate membership in that way. Say you imagine some small Nordic country like Norway, where it's become in some ways an increasingly multicultural society. But nevertheless, it is evolving in a way that is sort of distinctive and connected to certain ethos and common set of community norms, and that it is evolving in a way that is effectively under the control of Norwegians, including new Norwegians, rather than simply happening to it. Whereas if we imagine that if all of a sudden there was sort of no control whatsoever about who was sort of living and working in Norway, that there might be very rapid change such that many people who had been living there for a long time simply wouldn't recognize it as their society or as a society of the same sort anymore. But I think we do have an intuitive idea of what it means for a community to take on new ideas, to include new members, but nevertheless to sort of evolve according to its own terms over time.
So it seems that a free-for-all open border could create certain problems when it comes to maintaining our national identity. But in reality, most countries do exercise control over who gets to come in and who gets to stay. The global north is a term that refers to countries with high economic development. These include Australia, the United States, and the countries of Western Europe. In these countries, waves of migrants have been absorbed from all sorts of different cultures. We even see coffee nowadays as Australian.
It seems right to say that in order to have a democracy, people from different backgrounds need to be able to live together. But that's a really different idea from the idea of integration or assimilation, because the idea of integration or assimilation supposes that the norm of the dominant group is one that everybody should have to ascend to.
And that it's static.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the case that nations in the global north, their culture has changed in response to different immigrant groups. At some points, the cultures of the immigrant groups start to become part of what is thought of as the culture of the country, right? No one thinks of pizza as not American food, right? But 100 years ago, people would have thought of pizza as an exotic kind of food.
One of the fears that people have is that migrants and refugees and so on won't integrate into the Australian community. And the existence of pluralist societies like ours produces a challenge to that idea, because we find that this diversity within the community, religious and cultural and national and so on, has a lot of positive things to be said for it. One of the positive things is that it puts the idea of integration, tight integration, under challenge, because it shows that the values that are allegedly there are often not really very important anyway, or they're deeply wrong, or they could do with some refurbishing. Or they could find some more values that would fit into the mix. And as for, what are Australian values and so on, it seems to me there's an enormous amount of moonshine talked about this. People often produce something out of this mix and say, look, this is Australian. You find it's everywhere else in the world as well,
Mateship.
Mateship being one of the classic ones that comes out here. I don't want to deny that there are some distinctively Australian things. There are, though they've changed a lot over the years.
Even if we completely closed our borders, the Australian way of life would still undergo steady changes. How many American TV shows do you watch? And where does your music come from? How about the games you play? Even if we didn't admit a single foreign person, we'd still keep importing foreign culture. The right to determine who gets to come into your society has to be weighed against the moral reasons we have to let certain people into our territory, given the state of global inequality.
To portray the immigrant or the would-be immigrant as someone who's just eager to get in at all costs and would vastly prefer life in this new country to life back home. Often that's not the case. There are huge cultural, social, economic costs to leaving the country of your birth and the country where you grew up. John Rawls has this really nice passage in a book called Political Liberalism where in devising the principles of justice for a society, we're going to assume that people are born into that society and will leave only with death, so they'll not emigrate. And he says this isn't because we're not going to recognize the right to emigrate. Of course, that's a right. We're making that assumption in order to block out a very bad kind of justification to citizens that governments can give, which is that, well, look, if you don't like it, you can leave, right? That's a bad justification because leaving is a very difficult option, financially, emotionally, socially, culturally, for lots of people.
Migrants are often trying to get into Australia to escape hardship or rights violations in their home countries. Instead of just opening borders, we could try and use our resources and influence to improve conditions in these other countries.
It would be no acceptable justification to the person at your border to say that, look, we understand that the human rights conditions in your home state are just horrible, but we have this 30-year plan to help fix it. And all of us, these high-powered countries in the UN, we're working together we're on it, right? Recognizing that solving certain human rights problems will be a long-term project. In a way, strengthens the argument for admitting migrants, at least fleeing countries with unacceptable human rights conditions immediately. It's not clear that the current degree and extent of restrictions on borders that we see in the world right now would be justified, would be able to withstand moral scrutiny.
It's an uncomfortable fact, but we can't just wash our hands of the injustices and crises that lead people to want to try and leave their home countries. Many of the conditions driving attempted migration are consequences of a large global economic order. And Australia plays its part in maintaining that order.
So even if you hadn't played any causal role in the fact of dire poverty in certain parts of the world, if you have migrants from that part of the world at your borders, I don't think you can say, well, I had nothing to do with your conditions, so I have no responsibilities toward you. So there seems to be a general kind of humanitarian reason that's completely independent of your causal role in the crisis, the humanitarian crisis at stake.
Does Australia have a right to exclude as many migrants as it sees fit? The philosophical lesson here isn't just about how we answer that question. It's about the need to consider other questions at the same time. So we shouldn't just be asking whether borders should be open or closed. We also need to ask, why are so many migrants showing up at our borders in the first place? And what kind of responsibility do affluent countries like ours have for helping to create a world in which so much migration is taking place? What do you think? Next time, do animals have rights?